Every night, we slip into a world that vanishes by morning, a world built entirely inside our minds, yet one that feels real enough to make us cry, run, or fly. But what are dreams really? Are they stories written by the subconscious, or simply random sparks in the sleeping brain? Scientists have mapped their waves, recorded their flickers, then tried to decode them, yet the deeper we look, the stranger they become. From ancient rituals to AI dream recorders, from shared visions to lost memories. This is the hidden landscape behind our closed eyes, where biology, mystery, and meaning collide. Tonight, we're stepping into that quiet frontier to ask one haunting question. Do dreams actually exist? It begins quietly, as all crossings do. The body lies still, eyes heavy but restless. And somewhere between the soft hum of the room and the echo of one's last thought, the world begins to slide away. This fragile space between waking and sleep has a name, hypnagogia, a word first recorded by the French psychologist Alfred Maury in the mid-1800s. When he began to describe the strange visions that came to him as he drifted off, he called them hallucinations of the threshold, because that is what they are, a borderland. Half dream and half reality, where reason loosens its grip, and imagination begins to move like mist through the gaps of a tired mind. In this state, the brain flickers with small electric storms. A hand may feel like it's falling through the mattress. A sound may echo that no one else can hear. A door closing. A name whispered from a corner of the room. Around 1918, researchers in Leipzig recorded these fleeting bursts through early electroencephalography. Long before they fully understood what they were seeing, even today, scientists studying sleep at Harvard and Kyoto describe this phase as one of the most mysterious in the nightly cycle, because it is when consciousness does not vanish but bends, stretching across both worlds at once. As the minutes deepen, the muscles begin to soften under the rule of an ancient reflex, the body's quiet surrender to paralysis. It is the same evolutionary mechanism that keeps us safe during dreaming, preventing the limbs from acting out what the mind imagines. The shift is subtle, almost invisible, yet it marks a clear division. The body goes silent first, while the mind remains active, watching itself fade. If a person wakes too soon from this descent, they might experience what is known as sleep paralysis, a terrifying awareness where the eyes open. The mind is fully awake, but the body will not move. Records of such experiences stretch back to the 10th century. When European monks wrote of the hag that sits on the chest, mistaking neurology for visitation, within this fragile window, time behaves differently. A second may stretch endlessly, while a minute may vanish. Artists and inventors have long courted this moment for its strange creativity. Thomas Edison was said to nap with a steel ball in his hand, knowing that as soon as his muscles relaxed and the ball dropped, the sound would wake him and preserve the ideas that surfaced just before true sleep began. Salvador Dali copied this technique, claiming that his most surreal images were born between heartbeat and dream. When logic was suspended and the mind became a wandering camera, capturing fragments before they dissolved, inside the brain, a slow choreography begins. The thalamus, that small gatekeeper deep within the center, starts closing its channels to the outside world, reducing sensory noise. While the occipital lobe flickers like a dim projector, flashing shapes and color without meaning, the frontal cortex, our seat of reason, steps back, allowing emotion and memory to intertwine freely. Scientists from the University of Liege have described this as a neural twilight, a biological dusk where patterns of wakefulness and sleep overlap. It is in this fragile overlap that the first dream seeds take root. Some people, particularly those trained in meditation or lucid dreaming, can hover in this state for extended moments, aware of the drifting visions without fully entering them. They describe it as floating through thought itself, images unfolding not in front of the eyes but somewhere inside the skull, layered, translucent, and alive. In the 1980s, Japanese researchers measuring brain activity during such experiments noticed that the visual cortex remained active even with closed eyelids, suggesting that the mind does not stop seeing when the eyes are shut. It simply begins to see from within. As the heart rate slows and the body temperature drops, the last fragments of the day slip into abstraction. A sentence half-spoken becomes a murmur. A to-do list becomes a pattern of shifting light, and names or faces may appear without context, flickering for seconds before fading. This is not yet dreaming, not in the full narrative sense that will emerge in REM, but it is the soil from which dreams grow. It is a rehearsal of imagery and sensation, a loose rehearsal of life without the boundaries of the waking world by the time the first true REM wave arrives, usually about 90 minutes after sleep begins. The body has already surrendered completely to its nightly paralysis, and the mind, unburdened by sight or gravity, steps fully into its private cinema. But the doorway remains memorable, even if the dream itself is forgotten. Hypnagogia is the proof that sleep is not a plunge, but a passage, and that consciousness does not vanish like a switch turned off, but rather fades in layers, the way the horizon swallows the sun. It is that delicate pause between heartbeat and silence, the moment before the mind lets go, where thought dissolves into color, and color becomes the language of the night. Every night, without permission or plan, the human body begins to construct a silent architecture of rest, a cycle as old as life itself, built not of stone or light, but of rhythms buried deep within the folds of the brain. The descent into sleep is not a fall, but a gradual layering, a construction of stages that rise and collapse in predictable sequence, as though consciousness were a tide pulling slowly away from the shore. Scientists today divide this passage into 5 stages, each one measured not by feeling but by electric trace, the soft undulation of alpha, theta, and delta waves that flicker across the scalp like the whispers of a faraway storm in the earliest minutes. The body drifts through stage 1, a threshold as delicate as a breath held too long, where the eyes roll slowly beneath closed lids and the heartbeat begins to quiet. It was during the 1930s that the first electroencephalographs captured this transition, showing the brain shifting from quick, waking rhythms to slower looping patterns. The sleeper might twitch, might imagine falling or calling out before the muscles relax again. Then comes stage 2, a deeper basin of calm where the body temperature drops. The heartbeat steadies, and the mind begins its first rehearsal of forgetting. Researchers call this the stage of sleep spindles, sudden bursts of electrical activity that appear on the EEG as thin, fast streaks, lasting no more than 2 seconds. They are thought to protect the brain from waking too easily, wrapping the sleeper in a kind of neural insulation. Beyond this lies stage 3 and then stage 4, the deep sleep, the foundation of the night's architecture. It is here in the slow wave domain that the brain's great cleansing begins. In recent years, scientists at the University of Rochester have shown that cerebrospinal fluid washes through the brain during this phase, clearing out the day's molecular debris, waste proteins, and neural clutter. Much like a tide rinsing the shore before dawn, the waves recorded on instruments slow to less than 1 cycle per second, wide and heavy as though time itself had thickened. A person roused from this depth often wakes disoriented, struggling to recall where or who they are. The body, however, uses this darkness to rebuild tissue repairs. Hormones release, and the immune system steadies itself for another day's wear. And then, without warning, the pattern changes. The sleeper, still as stone, suddenly begins to move, not in limb, but in eye. This is the 5th stage, the strange and luminous world of REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. It was first recorded in 1953 by a graduate student named Eugene Osirensky at the University of Chicago, working under physiologist Nathaniel Kleitman. Late one night, Osirensky noticed that the eyes of a sleeping subject beneath his electrodes began darting rapidly, as though watching invisible scenes. When he woke the sleeper, they reported vivid dreams. That moment, simple and accidental, became the birth of modern dream research. Over the next decade, as laboratories from Paris to Tokyo replicated the finding, REM sleep was revealed not as a passive state but as an active one, a theater of emotion and memory unfolding behind the curtain of paralysis. In this peculiar phase, which recurs every 90 minutes in predictable waves through the night, The body is locked in near total stillness while the mind burns brightly. The electroencephalogram shows patterns almost identical to those of wakefulness, a paradox that puzzled researchers for decades. The heartbeat accelerates, breathing grows irregular, and blood pressure rises. It is as though the dreamer's world, invisible from the outside, were more alive than the waking one. In 1967, Michel Jouvet, a French neurophysiologist, called REM sleep paradoxical sleep, a fitting phrase for a brain that dreams fiercely while the body lies bound. Within these nightly cycles, each roughly an hour and a half long, a kind of internal clock keeps time, the circadian rhythm. Governed by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, it listens to light, to temperature, and even to the chemistry of the bloodstream, ensuring that sleep arrives not at random, but in patterned harmony with the Earth's turning. In 1972, researchers discovered that certain brainstem neurons, rich in acetylcholine, ignite during REM, creating the vivid sensory illusions we call dreams. These neurons fire so intensely that they flood the visual cortex with false images. And because the rational parts of the prefrontal cortex are mostly quiet, the dream's chaos feels convincing. Its logic unchallenged, yet this rhythm is not mere spectacle. It serves purpose. During the 1980s, experiments at Harvard by Robert Stickgold and later Matthew Walker revealed that memories formed during the day are replayed and reorganized in the hippocampus during sleep, particularly during REM and deep slow-wave stages. The brain replays patterns of activity, strengthening some connections, erasing others, sculpting experience into meaning. A child learning to read, a musician practicing scales, or a driver mastering a new route, all consolidate those patterns in the night's hidden architecture. Dreams, though often strange, are the byproduct of this nightly editing. Fragments of memory stitched together into loose storylines as the mind rehearses what to keep and what to discard. Emotion, too, is processed in these cycles. During REM, the amygdala, the small almond-shaped center of feeling, lights up more intensely than almost any other region. The brain revisits fears, griefs, and hopes, not to relive them, but to soften their edges. Studies in the 1990s showed that people deprived of REM became irritable, anxious, and prone to emotional overreaction, as though their internal weather system had failed to reset. It is the dream that performs this recalibration, turning the chaos of the day into something bearable by the time dawn approaches. The night's structure has built and dissolved itself several times over. The early cycles favor deep, restorative sleep. The later ones fill with longer REM periods, lasting up to 45 minutes. In that final dream before waking, the architecture begins to crumble. The electric waves returning to waking frequency, and the body stirs once more. Every night, the brain builds this cathedral of sleep foundation, tower and dome, not to escape the world, but to maintain the fragile balance that lets us return to it again, whole, remembering just enough of the dream to know that something within us has kept watch. It began in dimly lit rooms filled with the quiet hum of machines. Long before sleep itself was understood as something measurable, when a few curious scientists decided that even in darkness the mind might still be speaking. In the 1950s, laboratories in Chicago, Paris, and Zurich began wiring volunteers to heavy consoles that filled entire walls. Machines that blinked and clicked and traced the invisible language of the sleeping brain onto rolls of paper. What they found in those early years reshaped the modern idea of consciousness. The pioneers of this strange new field, Nathaniel Kleitman, William Dement, and others built what would become the first sleep laboratories. Places where silence was recorded and rest became data. A typical experiment began at dusk. The subject would be led into a narrow room with a single bed and covered in a network of fine wires, each one attached to the scalp, chest, or fingertips with cold adhesive paste. These wires, connected to an electroencephalograph, picked up the faint electrical pulses of the brain, the flutter of eye muscles, the steady rhythm of the heart. The subject might lie awake for a long time, blinking against the faint red light that never went out, before surrendering to exhaustion. In the next room, a researcher would sit in the glow of green and amber lights, watching the thin ink lines crawl across paper, tracing the inner tides of another person's night. It was in this world of late night observation that one of the great discoveries of the 20th century was made. In 1953, a graduate student named Eugene Osorensky, while working under Nathaniel Kleitman at the University of Chicago, noticed something peculiar on his EEG recordings. During certain periods of deep sleep, the subject's eyes began to dart rapidly beneath closed lids, and the brainwaves suddenly looked almost awake. When he gently woke the subjects during these episodes, they reported vivid dreams, so vivid that they could recount scenes, faces, even colors. This was the birth of rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, the moment when the machines that watched us dream first revealed that the sleeping mind was not resting at all, but running wild. By 1957, Kleitman and his student William Dement had begun to chart the pattern of REM and non-REM cycles through the night, discovering that they repeated roughly every 90 minutes in predictable waves. Dement would later open one of the first dedicated sleep clinics at Stanford University, where hundreds of patients would come to have their nights dissected by technology. In his papers from 1963, he described sleep as an active and orderly process, not the passive collapse it had once been thought to be. The laboratory became a place of astonishment, where dreams could be timed, measured, and even anticipated. The slow rise and fall of brainwaves became a script, and the scientist sitting in the next room became a silent witness to the hidden theater of another's mind. But there was something strangely intimate, even unsettling, about being watched in this way. Volunteers spoke of feeling exposed, as though their thoughts were being read. Because the machines did not merely record sleep, they recorded surrender. In 1965, at Stanford's fledgling sleep lab, a journalist described the experience of being wired to 20 electrodes and told not to move, knowing that behind the glass, a technician was noting every twitch and sigh. The room itself seemed to breathe, filled with the soft rustle of paper and the steady beat of the polygraph pen. Each spike and dip was a whisper from the subconscious, drawn in ink for others to interpret. The technology evolved quickly. By the late 1960s, oscillographs gave way to digital storage, and slow tracings became glowing screens. Researchers could now monitor multiple people at once, comparing their sleep patterns through the long hours of the night. They noticed that REM became longer toward dawn, that deprivation of it led to irritability and hallucination, and that every dream left a faint but measurable echo in the body's physiology. The field, once a curiosity, had become a science. Sleep laboratories multiplied across universities, their walls lined with tangled cables and faint humming from tape recorders that captured not only brain waves but breathing, pulse, and the smallest muscle contractions. In 1968, Alan Rekshafan and Anthony Kales published what would become the first standardized manual for scoring sleep stages, defining the boundaries of the night in terms of voltage, frequency, and amplitude. For the first time, sleep could be described in a common language across continents, and the invisible architecture of dreaming minds could be compared like blueprints. The machines had turned private nights into public knowledge. Yet even as the field grew more technical, the wonder of those early experiments never quite faded. Scientists often spoke of sitting alone in the lab at 3 a.m, the only sound the slow churn of the EEG, watching as the graph suddenly erupted in fast, jagged lines that meant the dreamer had crossed into REM again. They knew that behind the still face of the sleeper, entire world was unfolding: streets, voices, storms, or something nameless. And yet, for all the graphs and measurements, no machine could record what that world looked like or how it felt. The intimacy of those rooms was both scientific and human. To study sleep was to look at a person stripped of every defense, eyes closed, breathing slow, thoughts unguarded. In those moments, the laboratory became more like a chapel than a clinic, filled with the quiet reverence of watchers who knew they were glimpsing something sacred. The sleeper would wake at dawn, unaware of the lines of ink that mapped their night, while the scientists would roll up the long scrolls of data and begin their analysis, trying once again to translate what the machines had seen into words. By the end of that decade, the study of dreams had moved from philosophy into physiology, and the flickering screens of the sleep labs had replaced Freud's couch as the new frontier of the unconscious. Still, for all the data gathered and charts drawn, the experience remained oddly personal, the sense that, in recording another person's sleep, one was trespassing into the most private landscape of all. Those early machines did not simply watch us dream. They made us aware that, even in our deepest silence, we were never truly alone. For someone or something was always listening to the hum of our hidden night. The dream once belonged only to poets and philosophers, to those who could describe it but never measure it. Yet in the late 20th century, a new kind of explorer arrived, one armed not with ink or verse but with machines that could see beneath the skull. These were the cartographers of sleep, men and women who believed that the brain, even in its most private state, could be charted like an undiscovered country. Each flicker of light or shadow of blood flow, a mountain range or river system in an unseen landscape. What they sought was not the dream itself, but its terrene, the regions that came alive when the body lay still and the mind slipped into its nightly voyage through memory and imagination. It began with the slow revolution of brain imaging. In the 1990s, scientists at the University of Wisconsin, Kyoto University, and the Max Planck Institute began using positron emission tomography, PET scans, to measure how glucose moved through the brain during sleep. To their surprise, they found that during REM, the very phase when the eyes dart behind closed lids and dreams burn bright, the limbic system flared with activity while the rational prefrontal cortex dimmed, as though the emotional parts of the mind had risen to power while reason slept. The amygdala, hippocampus, and occipital lobes, the centers of emotion, memory, and vision glowed red and gold on their monitors, proof that dreams were not mere chaos but coordinated neural storms. With patterns as repeatable as weather, as imaging technology advanced, magnetic resonance machines replaced the old PET scanners, allowing researchers to observe the living brain in finer detail without radiation. The functional MRI, or fMRI, introduced in the early 1990s, became the new compass for these dream cartographers. Unlike earlier tools that offered still pictures, the fMRI traced motion itself, blood rushing into active regions, oxygen feeding the cells that fired during thought. When sleepers entered REM, the images showed sudden bursts of color around the visual cortex, as if the mind had turned on a secret projector. In 2007, Yukiyasu Kamitani and his team at ATR, Computational Neuroscience Laboratories in Kyoto, achieved what once seemed impossible. They began decoding fragments of visual imagery from the sleeping brain. Their method was both elegant and eerie. They trained participants to watch hundreds of images while awake objects, faces, shapes, and scenes while recording the unique fMRI patterns each one produced. Then, while those same participants slept, the researchers compared the dreamtime activity against the waking library of images. When the scans matched, they could predict with surprising accuracy what kind of object the dreamer might be seeing, something round like a clock or vertical like a tree. In 2013, Kamitani's group announced the first partial reconstruction of dream content using machine learning, a step that turned abstract thought into visible trace. It was not perfect and it was not yet art, but it was enough to make the scientific community pause. For the first time in history, someone had glimpsed a picture from a dream not by remembering it, but by watching it form in real time through the glow of a machine. Still, these maps were incomplete, like the earliest sketches of the New World's accurate in some parts, wildly distorted in others. The fMRI, powerful as it was, captured blood flow, not thought itself. And each pixel represented thousands of neurons working in concert, translating that vast complexity into the simple image of a face or landscape. Required algorithms that were still learning how to think like people. Scientists at Berkeley, led by Jack Gallant in the 2010s, attempted similar reconstructions by analyzing patterns in the visual cortex of awake subjects watching movie clips. Their software could produce ghostly, shifting frames that resembled the original footage, suggesting that dreams, too, might one day be replayed, not remembered, but rendered. Such experiments brought both fascination and unease. To map dreams was to trespass into a territory once considered sacred, the only refuge of true privacy. The machines could not yet know meaning or context. They could only show the shape of activity, the rise of emotion, the surge of vision. But in these maps, something remarkable was happening. Science was beginning to give form to imagination, to locate the unseeable. Sleep, once thought to be silence, was revealed as a chorus of signals. In the Harvard sleep labs of the late 1990s, researchers noted that the default mode network, the brain's introspective system, remained active throughout REM, linking scattered memories into loose narratives. What had once been called nonsense now had its circuitry drawn in color and light. And yet, for every map drawn, the explorers found a greater mystery waiting. They discovered that the same regions that created dreams also processed creativity when awake. Artists, writers, and composers shared patterns similar to REM activation during moments of inspiration. The border between sleeping and waking imagination began to blur, suggesting that both were part of a larger, continuous world, the mind's unbroken geography. By the early 2020s, artificial intelligence had entered the field, helping neuroscientists sift through mountains of fMRI data to refine their cartography. Teams at MIT and the University of Toronto developed neural networks that could predict, from real-time scans, whether a subject was dreaming or merely resting, and some began to imagine devices that might one day record dreams automatically, translating blood flow into light, light into image, and image into story. Yet even as the machines grew more sophisticated, the scientists themselves spoke of limits. They could measure the storm, but not the sea beneath it. They could trace the paths of neurons, but not the feeling of the dream, the warmth of a remembered hand, the fear of a fall, the sudden joy of flight. Those belonged to another language, one that no machine could yet read, in a sense. Every fMRI image became a kind of map that required imagination to interpret, a dialogue between what the instrument could see and what the human mind could guess. The cartographers of sleep had not conquered the dream world. They had merely found a way to glimpse its borders, to sketch its faint outlines against the dark. Somewhere beyond those glowing images lay the unmeasurable, the story each person tells to themselves in the night, the hidden continent of feeling that resists translation. And as the machines continued to hum in their glass chambers, painting the brain in colors of fire and shadow, the dream remained what it always had been, a secret terrain we wander alone, though now, for the first time, someone is tracing our footsteps as we go. When the modern study of dreams began, it did not start with machines or electrodes, but with notebooks filled by men who listened, who believed that behind every dream there was a code to be broken, a private language that spoke in symbols instead of words. Sigmund Freud, in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, was one of the first to propose that dreams were not random flickers of the sleeping mind, but messages from the hidden parts of ourselves. In 1899, his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, appeared, though it was dated 1900, a deliberate gesture, I said, to mark the beginning of a new century of thought. He described dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, a path through which repressed desires, fears, and forgotten memories found expression, disguised in images so strange that only analysis could reveal their meaning. A locked door might be an opportunity denied, a staircase, an unspoken impulse, a fall, the collapse of control. To Freud, nothing in the dream was without purpose, and everything, from the smallest gesture to the most chaotic scene, could be traced to something buried deep within the dreamer's history. But Freud's world was still one of private confession, built on couches and long hours of speech, and soon another mind would widen its boundaries. Carl Jung, once his student and later his critic, believed that dreams were not merely the echoes of personal repression, but windows into a collective human inheritance. Around 1912, when he began to write Symbols of Transformation, he spoke of something larger than the individual psyche, a shared reservoir of images and instincts that belonged to everyone, a vast interior landscape he called the collective unconscious. Within it lived what he named the archetypes, recurring figures that appeared not only in dreams, but in myths, Stories and religions across time. The mother, the shadow, the hero, the serpent, the wise old man. These were not learned, but inherited, woven into the structure of the mind itself. To Jung, when a person dreamed of falling, flying, or drowning, it was not simply a private drama, but a reenactment of ancient patterns. Symbols passed down like genetic code through generations. As psychoanalysis spread, so too did the curiosity about whether these symbols might cross cultural lines. In Egypt, where dreams were recorded on papyrus as early as 2000 BCE, the priests of Asclepius interpreted them as messages from the gods, direct channels between the mortal and the divine. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, discovered near Thebes, lists interpretations for hundreds of dream images. To dream of eating crocodile flesh meant gaining favor with the king. To dream of walking through clear water promised purification. To dream of a falling star signaled divine warning. The Greeks carried this tradition into their temples of healing, where the sick would sleep and wait for a god to appear in their dreams, prescribing cures that the priests would later interpret by morning light. Far to the east, in China and Japan, the dream held equal authority, but different logic. In Chinese philosophy, dreams were the realm where the soul traveled beyond the body, a place where yin and yang could reverse roles, where ancestors could visit or warn. During the Tang dynasty, poets like Li Bai wrote of the dream that returns to the homeland, seeing in it both nostalgia and prophecy. In Japan, dreams were considered omens tied to the calendar. The first dream of the new year, called Hatsu Yum, was especially sacred. To dream of Mount Fuji, a hawk, or an eggplant on that first night was said to promise fortuna, curious mix of symbol and superstition that still persists in Japanese culture today, across the centuries and continents. Though certain images continued to appear as if drawn from a shared well. The sensation of falling, for instance, is reported in nearly every culture, a sudden drop that jerks the dreamer awake, heart racing. Scientists now link it to the body's hypnic jerk, the muscular spasm that occurs as we slip into sleep. But for Freud and Jung, it carried emotional weight. The fall as surrender, as failure as loss of control. Flying, by contrast, was its inverse, the dream of freedom, transcendence, or escape. In Jung's notes from the 1920s, he described recurring patients who dreamed of soaring over cities or mountains during times of personal change, interpreting it as the psyche's symbolic release from constraint. Drowning, too, has echoed across millennia, appearing in the dreams of priests, soldiers, mothers, and children alike. To drown was to be consumed by emotion, to merge with something vast, or, as Jung wrote in a letter to a colleague in 1934, to return to the unconscious sea from which all images are born. The repetition of such symbols puzzled scholars. Were they coincidence, biology, or evidence of some deeper order of mind? Anthropologists studying Aboriginal Australia found that dream imagery there also revolved around transformation in water. Themes central to creation stories that saw the world itself born from the dreamtime. The eternal landscape of ancestral memory. Meanwhile, in 1966, an American anthropologist named Kilton Stewart introduced the term Sonoy dream theory after observing the Sonoy people of Malaysia, who practiced daily dream-sharing rituals, interpreting dreams as messages meant to guide moral and communal life. Although later studies questioned his accuracy, the idea itself that dream symbols served as social maps, not just personal ones, left a lasting impression on Western thinkers searching for meaning beyond the self. By the late 20th century, neuroscience began to erode the certainties of symbolic interpretation, replacing metaphor with mechanism. Yet even among scientists there remained a quiet respect for what these older frameworks revealed about human continuity. For all the machines that could scan blood flow or trace electrical pulses, none could explain why the same symbols persisted. Why the mind, no matter its language or geography, returned again and again to images of ascent and descent, pursuit and escape, water and flight. It may be that symbols, like dreams themselves, belong to both worlds at once, part biology, part myth. The dream of falling could be a reflex born of muscle and gravity. The dream of flying, a memory of freedom that predates words. The dream of drowning, a dialogue between breath and fear. Freud believed that meaning was hidden, that dreams concealed truth. Jung believed that meaning was revealed, that dreams exposed our deepest kinship with the human story. And somewhere between their two visions, the language of symbols continues to speak. Not in words, but in sensations, the thud of falling, the rush of air. The pull of water reminding us that even when our minds wander beyond waking reason, they remain bound to the same ancient grammar that shaped us all. During the tense decades of the Cold War, when nations competed not only in arms and space, but in understanding the mind itself, laboratories across America, the Soviet Union, and Europe became strange frontiers where sleep and dreams were dissected like new technologies waiting to be harnessed. Behind unmarked doors and soundproof rooms, scientists wired volunteers to monitors that hummed softly in the dark, watching how long they could stay awake, what visions they saw when exhaustion took over, and whether dreams themselves could be manipulated, recorded, or even directed. What began as curiosity soon grew into obsession, as governments realized that to control the mind's rhythms might one day mean to control endurance, obedience, or creativity itself. At Stanford University in the early 1960s, a young researcher named William Dement, already known for his work in mapping rapid eye movement sleep, turned his attention to deprivation. He wanted to know what would happen if a person were denied rest not for a night, but for days. In the narrow halls of the Stanford Sleep Laboratory, volunteers, mostly students drawn by small stipends and curiosity, lay under bright lights as researchers kept them awake through conversation, mental puzzles, or the occasional shock of cold air. Electrodes traced the fatigue spreading through their brains like slow waves rolling toward a shore. By the second night, speech began to slur. By the third, hallucinations crept in. Some subjects saw faces in the ceiling or heard voices whispering from walls that were perfectly still. Dement noted in his journals that after 70 hours, many began to dream while awake, their minds generating fragments of REM even as their eyes remained open. These studies were not cruel for cruelty's sake. They revealed how fragile consciousness could be, how dreams were not a luxury, but a requirement, a nightly repair mechanism that the brain demanded no matter what the clock said. Across the Atlantic, Soviet scientists conducted their own experiments in the secretive Institute for Brain Research in Leningrad. Records declassified. Decades later, described attempts to explore suggested dreaming, a process where sleepers were exposed to sound cues or whispered phrases during REM to influence the content of their dreams. The goal, though never officially stated, seemed clear. If messages could be planted in dreams, then the subconscious might be used as a tool of persuasion or resistance. Western observers dismissed such research as pseudoscience, yet similar work quietly continued in American universities. Funded under the vague heading of psychophysiological studies, not all experiments were shadowed by politics. Many were born from wonder, the question of whether the dreaming mind could solve problems that eluded the waking one. In 1965, researchers at Harvard's Department of Psychology began running controlled tests on dream incubation, asking students to focus on unsolved tasks before sleep and report any insights upon waking. One participant, a mathematician named Keith Hearn, later described how, after dreaming of numbers arranged in a spiral, he awoke with the solution to a geometry proof he had struggled with for days. The phenomenon seemed to echo something humanity had known intuitively for centuries, that the night was not an interruption of reason, but its silent extension. History is full of stories where the boundaries between dreaming and discovery blur. The German chemist August Keckel, writing in his memoirs of 1890, recalled how, after long hours studying the structure of carbon molecules, he fell into a doze by the fire and dreamed of atoms dancing before his eyes, forming a serpent that seized its own tail. When he awoke, the image of the Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of infinity, gave him the idea of the benzene ring, the circular structure that became one of chemistry's greatest breakthroughs. A century later, The same tale would be cited in countless psychology texts as proof of the creative power of sleep. Another often told story belongs to Elias Howe, the American inventor of the sewing machine. In the 1840s, frustrated by his failed designs, Howe dreamed of being chased by warriors carrying spears with holes near their tips. When he awoke, he realized that the key to his machine was placing the needle's eye near the point, not at the base. This dream transformed textile manufacturing forever. And though skeptics later questioned its accuracy, the symbolism was unmistakably problem solved not by logic, but by image. The mind, in sleep, had drawn the blueprint that waking thought could not. Even the double helix. That elegant ladder of life's code was touched by the night's experiments. Francis Crick, who with James Watson would win the Nobel Prize in 1962, admitted that he often worked on complex structural problems by letting them simmer in sleep. Crick would later write about what he called the astonishing hypothesis, the idea that dreams served as the brain's way of organizing and discarding unnecessary information, pruning neural connections, much as a gardener trims branches to let others grow. Though more cautious than his predecessors, he too believed that somewhere in the private theater of dreaming, invention was at work. During the 1970s, as technology advanced, researchers began attaching subjects to computers that could detect the onset of REM in real time. One of the most famous studies was conducted by Charles Tart at the University of California, Davis, who investigated lucid dreaming, the ability to realize one is dreaming while inside the dream. Tart's volunteers were trained to signal the experimenters by moving their eyes in prearranged patterns once they became aware. The success of these experiments suggested that communication across the boundary of consciousness was possible, however briefly, and that the sleeping mind could collaborate with the waking world. By the late years of the Cold War, the fascination with dreams had moved from the laboratory into technology companies and creative industries. NASA's Ames Research Center experimented with sleep cycles to improve astronaut alertness during long missions. And corporate think tanks studied dream enhancement techniques to encourage innovation among engineers and designers. While many of these programs faded into obscurity, they left behind a strange legacy, a belief that the subconscious might be not only a source of mystery, but a renewable resource, a place where ideas could be mind-like or, looking back, those decades seem almost cinematic rooms, filled with the glow of analog monitors, the steady scratching of pens recording waves of brain activity, and the soft breathing of sleepers who, without knowing, carried within them the dreams of nations competing to understand the human mind. What those experiments ultimately revealed was that sleep is not a passive escape from life, but a continuation of it. A nightly experiment that every mind conducts in solitude. Governments sought endurance. Scientists sought knowledge. Artists sought inspiration. Yet all found the same truth, that within the darkness of the night, the dreaming brain keeps building, imagining, and remembering in ways that still defy the instruments watching it. When humanity first broke free from Earth's gravity, scientists at NASA faced a question that seemed almost poetic in its simplicity, yet deeply scientific in its consequences. Would astronauts still dream once they left the planet? No one knew what sleep would be like in zero gravity, whether the brain, deprived of familiar rhythms and pulled away from the constant tug of gravity, could still slip into that nightly architecture of rest and imagination. In the early 1960s, when the Mercury and Gemini programs were still in their infancy, physicians such as Dr. Charles Berry and flight surgeons at the manned spacecraft center in Houston began to wonder if space travel would alter the human circadian rhythm so profoundly that normal dreaming might vanish altogether. After all, astronauts orbiting the Earth would witness 16 sunrises and sunsets every 24 hours, a rhythm no body was built to understand. And the question was not only whether they could sleep, but whether they could dream. The first men to sleep beyond the atmosphere spoke of a kind of suspended rest, where drifting replaced lying down, and the body never fully forgot that it was floating. When John Glenn orbited the Earth aboard Friendship 7 in 1962, he reported short bursts of sleep, not true slumber, but brief, weightless dozing. His heart rate slowed, his temperature dropped slightly, yet he described waking often, his body confused by the absence of downward pressure. Later, during the Gemini missions of 1965 and 1966, astronauts such as Jim Lovell and Frank Borman were wired with electrocardiogram leads and monitored through their helmets, providing the first crude physiological data on sleep in space. Lovell noted in his debrief that dreams, when they did come, felt strange and fleeting, as though they lacked gravity not only in body, but in form. No clear setting, no sense of direction. Just floating sensations and flashes of Earth far below. NASA engineers realized quickly that without gravity, the usual cues that guided human sleep, blood pressure shifts, muscle relaxation, the pressure of the body against the bed, were absent. The vestibular system, the tiny balance organs inside the inner ear, became confused in microgravity, sending mixed signals that could disrupt the sense of up and down. For some astronauts, this produced space adaptation syndrome, a kind of motion sickness that blurred the boundary between waking and dreaming. They described half-sleep states where the mind created vivid imagery, stars streaking past, phantom rotations, or the sight of continents turning beneath their eyelids. These were the first reports of what NASA doctors later called Earth-light dreams, a phenomenon in which the sleeping mind conjured the blue-white curve of Earth as seen from orbit, glowing in the darkness like a heartbeat during the Apollo program. Between 1968 and 1972, dream reports became more detailed. The longer missions, Apollo 8, Apollo 11, and especially Apollo 15 and 17, offered enough time for the astronauts' biological clocks to drift entirely out of sync with the 24-hour cycle. There was no sunrise, no nightfall, only the slow alternation of light and shadow as the spacecraft circled the moon or coasted through the void. Michael Collins, who remained in lunar orbit during Apollo 11, later wrote in his 1974 memoir, "Carrying the fire, that sleep came like diving into a black ocean, where dreams were faint but present, usually filled with fragments of Earth voices from Houston, trees, running water, or the faces of family members." He described waking to the hum of the oxygen system and needing several seconds to remember where he was, as if consciousness itself had to travel back from another world. Neil Armstrong mentioned his dreams only briefly, telling a post-flight interviewer that they were curiously flat, perhaps due to exhaustion, perhaps because the mind, overwhelmed by reality, had little need for invention. Buzz Aldrin, on the other hand, spoke years later of dreaming vividly about color, about a kind of light that seemed to pulse rather than shine. Psychologists suggested this could have been the afterimage of prolonged exposure to the sun's glare reflected off the lunar surface. Yet Aldrin believed it had something to do with the mind trying to translate the alien stillness into symbols it could understand. Sleep. Research aboard Skylab in the early 1970s confirmed that astronauts experienced real REM cycles in orbit. Electroencephalographs placed inside their helmets showed the same bursts of eye movement and brainwave activity found on Earth, though the timing was irregular. Scientists like Dr. William Dement and Dr. Howard Hoffman, who studied the data, noticed that REM periods lengthened as the missions progressed, suggesting that once the body adapted to microgravity, dreaming became more stable. Yet the content of those dreams remained harder to interpret. Skylab crew members reported bizarre imagery, tools floating away, rooms spinning without walls, or being unable to tell if they were inside or outside the spacecraft. These reflected, perhaps, the subconscious mind's attempt to impose orientation where none existed. The longer astronauts stayed in orbit, the more their circadian rhythms unraveled. Without the natural cues of sunlight and darkness, the body's internal clock, governed by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, began to drift, sometimes by as much as 2 hours per day. NASA eventually installed timed light panels to simulate day and night. But even so, the mind's sense of time remained elastic. Many astronauts described a disorientation of waking, not knowing whether it was morning or evening, their dreams filled with clocks, calendars, or revolving Earths that seemed to mock the idea of keeping time at all. In 1981, when the first space shuttle missions began, NASA included dedicated sleep and circadian researchers on the medical teams. They observed that space travelers, particularly during long missions aboard Columbia and Challenger, reported dreams that were unusually emotionally or often about family or home. Psychologists at Johnson Space Center speculated that isolation, confinement, and distance intensified the brain's attachment imagery, causing the sleeping mind to compensate with powerful, comforting visions. In one study from 1985, conducted after Challenger's STS for 1G flight, astronauts described recurring dreams of rainstorms and oceans, both impossible sights in orbit, yet symbolic of gravity and return. Over time, these accounts became a quiet tradition among astronauts, a private archive of the sleeping mind in space. Some saw them as reflections of longing, others as evidence that even among stars, the human brain remains loyal to Earth's rhythm. In 2013, astronaut Chris Hadfield, aboard the International Space Station, shared that he often dreamed of floating over Canada or hearing birds. The psychologists analyzing his remarks noted that these terrestrial echoes might be the brain's way of anchoring identity, maintaining psychological balance in an environment where every reference point is gone. Perhaps the most haunting realization from all these decades of observation is that dreams, even when unmoored from the planet, still belong to it. The absence of gravity, the silence of space, the endless horizon of stars, none of it erases the instinct to recreate the world we left behind. The body clock may drift, the day may lose its meaning. Yet within the fragile human brain, the same cycles continue: descent into sleep, the rise of REM, and the quiet birth of dream. Even far from home, in the weightless dark between worlds, the mind keeps orbiting what it knows, returning again and again to the same glowing sphere it calls home. Every night, as the body sinks into its quiet rhythm and the room fades to darkness, the brain begins to build another world, a place that looks and feels almost real, though it is, stitched together entirely from memory, emotion, and imagination. Inside that world, people speak, light moves, and gravity obeys strange rules. Yet everything seems natural until the moment of waking. Scientists have long tried to understand how this illusion is created, how the mind can construct a convincing universe behind closed eyes and make us believe in its logic, even when that logic defies every principle of waking life. In the past century, the slow unraveling of this mystery has revealed that dreams are not random stories, but the work of a hidden theater within the brain. A complex network where certain regions go silent and others come alive, reversing the balance that rules consciousness. The sense of realism in dreams arises because, during rapid eye movement sleep, the phase when most vivid dreaming occurs, the same sensory areas that interpret sight, sound, touch, and movement in waking life remain remarkably active. Functional imaging, particularly fMRI studies from the 1990s onward, showed that the occipital cortex, which handles vision, and the temporal lobes, which process sound and language, light up in patterns strikingly similar to those observed when a person is awake and perceiving the real world. The difference is that the source of input is internal, not external. Instead of light hitting the retina or air vibrating in the ear, the brain reactivates stored impressions, fragments of perception from days, months, or years before, weaving them together like pieces of film into new sequences. This is why a dream can recreate a childhood home with uncanny accuracy or fill a street with faces that seem familiar but cannot be placed. The brain is not inventing from nothing. It is editing its archive, playing back memory through the lens of emotion. What makes the dream strange is not that these sensory regions are awake, but that the parts of the brain responsible for order and judgment are not. The prefrontal cortex, the area that handles reasoning, logic, and self-awareness, largely shuts down during REM. This region, sometimes described as the director of consciousness, normally ensures that thoughts follow rules, that time moves in one direction, and that we remember who we are and where we stand in space. When it goes quiet, the stage is left open for improvisation. The narrative no longer needs to make sense. Events can shift instantaneously, and the dreamer accepts them without question. A person can fly, pass through walls, or encounter the dead without surprise. Because the voice that normally whispers this is impossible has fallen silent. In the early 2000s, sleep researchers like Mark Solms at the University of Cape Town compared brain scans of dreaming and waking states, showing that this prefrontal inactivity corresponded directly to the dreamer's loss of critical insight. The reason most of us do not realize we are dreaming until we wake, while the rational centers sleep, other regions surge into dominance. The amygdala, the small almond-shaped structure deep in the limbic system that governs fear and emotion, becomes highly active, more so even than during wakefulness. Alongside it, the anterior cingulate cortex, associated with motivation and emotional conflict, glows brightly in imaging studies. Together, they transform the dream from a passive sequence into a felt experience. The emotions are real, even when the events are not. Terror, longing, grief, and joy flood the system without restraint. Because the circuits that normally regulate or suppress them, the orbitofrontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, are quiet, in effect, the brain is allowing emotion to direct the play, writing, and performing the script simultaneously. This is why dreams often feel cinematic. They are shot with intensity, colored by feeling, and edited by association rather than logic. When researchers in Zurich and Montreal first examined REM activity in the 1990s using positron emission tomography, they remarked that the patterns resembled those seen in people watching films, strong activation in the visual and emotional regions, but reduced control in executive areas. It was as if the brain, deprived of external input, decided to make its own movie, using emotion as the screenwriter and memory as the set designer. The narrative, therefore, tends to follow emotional logic rather than chronological order. A dream might begin in a classroom, leap suddenly to a train station, and end in a storm at sea. Each transition triggered not by story, but by feeling, a sense of anxiety that flows from one image to the next. This inversion of power, where emotion rules and reason sleeps, explains not only the irrational quality of dreams, but also their deep persuasiveness. During waking life, sensory input and rational analysis work together to test reality. But in dreams, perception operates without verification. The mind does not question because the mechanism for questioning has been muted. In this sense, dreaming is the brain's rehearsal for imagination, its nightly exercise in suspension of disbelief. The images may be inconsistent, yet the experience feels coherent because the emotional centers ensure continuity, linking moments through tone and sensation rather than logic. There are moments, however, when fragments of awareness intrude, when the prefrontal cortex flickers briefly back to life, allowing the dreamer to recognize the illusion. These are the lucid dreams that researchers like Stephen Lauberg documented in the 1980s. It's instances where the sleeper realizes they are dreaming, yet remains within the dream, using eye movement signals as markers. Lauberg proved that such awareness correlated with a partial reactivation of the frontal lobes. In those moments, the dream becomes self-directed again, as though the mind's hidden theater had welcomed its director back for a few brief scenes before the curtain fell. Even so, most dreams remain under the command of the limbic system, that ancient part of the brain older than language itself, which thrives on symbolism and emotion rather than thought. It stitches together fragments from the past day and overheard conversation, a passing worry, a remembered face, and transforms them into drama, often exaggerated, sometimes profound. A lost wallet becomes a dream of exile. A missed appointment turns into an endless chase. These transformations reveal not what we consciously think, but how deeply we feel. And the theater that stages them is both chaotic and precise, ancient yet personal, always rebuilding itself with whatever materials the day provides. In this way, dreams are the most private form of storytelling the mind knows, performed each night in darkness for an audience of one. They feel real because in many ways they are. The brain's lights are still burning. The actors are its own memories, and the emotions that surge across the stage are the same that move us in life. The only difference is that the director has stepped away, leaving the heart to run the show, and until morning returns. Reason must wait in the wings, every night, As the body lies still and the world around it fades into quiet, the brain enters a state that on the surface looks like rest, but in truth is anything but passive. Because deep inside the skull, a second world begins to stir, one filled with movement, emotion, and flickers of light that no one else can see. For generations, scientists, philosophers, and poets have asked the same question: why do we dream at all? And while theories have shifted and multiplied with every new discovery, the most persistent idea is that dreaming is not a random accident of sleep, but an evolutionary adaptation. A nightly rehearsal of survival itself. The mind, it seems, has never truly stopped defending us, even in the depths of rest in the 19th century. When dream study was still tangled with mysticism, people imagined dreams as messages from gods or fragments of the soul wandering free from the body. But as neuroscience advanced through the 20th century, a different picture began to form, one rooted in biology rather than spirit. Researchers such as Alan Hobson and Robert McCarley, who in 1977 proposed the activation synthesis model of dreaming, suggested that the brainstem generates bursts of electrical activity during REM sleep, which the higher brain then attempts to weave into coherent stories. Yet this did not fully explain why these chaotic signals evolved in the first place. Why animals across species from rats to elephants experienced REM, or why the absence of it led to psychological unraveling. It was the Finnish neuroscientist Ante Revensuo who, in the late 1990s, offered a theory that reframed the entire discussion. He called it the threat simulation theory, proposing that dreams evolved as a biological defense mechanism, a kind of virtual reality simulator that allowed early humans to practice facing danger without suffering real harm. In the safety of sleep, the brain could rehearse running from predators, navigating ambushes, or surviving storms, refining its reactions in ways that improved survival when the body awoke. Revensuo's studies of dream reports supported the idea. Across cultures and centuries, people most often dreamed not of pleasure, but of pursuit, conflict, loss, and escape. The dream world, he suggested, was the mind's training ground, its nightly laboratory of fear. Even modern sleep laboratories, filled with their humming machines and electrodes, seem to confirm some part of this instinctive logic. During REM sleep, the stage, most associated with vivid dreaming, the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex, both central to the processing of threat and emotion, fire with extraordinary intensity. Heart rate and respiration fluctuate wildly. The body, though paralyzed by atonia, behaves as if engaged in invisible struggle. Experiments at Harvard Medical School in the early 2000s found that subjects who viewed emotionally charged images during the day showed reduced stress responses after a night of REM, as though the brain had reprocessed the emotion in a controlled virtual space. In essence, dreaming had performed a kind of emotional triage, sorting, softening, and storing fear in manageable form. Dreaming also plays a role in the consolidation of memory and reaction. In studies led by Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley participants who learned a sequence of tasks before sleep performed them faster and with fewer errors after a night rich in REM. Brain scans revealed that the patterns of neural activity recorded during learning were replayed in miniature during dreaming, as if the brain were rerunning the footage to strengthen the connections. The same process has been observed in animals. Rats navigating a maze during the day show identical firing sequences in their hippocampal neurons during sleep, suggesting that dreams, or at least remic reactivations, help preserve learned roots and skills. To dream, then, may be to remember how to survive, to prepare the mind for what it may face again. Animals, to betray hints of their own dreamscapes. In 1965, Michel Jouvet, the French neurophysiologist who coined the term paradoxical sleep, observed that cats deprived of the muscle paralysis typical of REM began acting out their dreams, crouching, pouncing, and even hissing at invisible prey while still asleep. Decades later, infrared cameras captured dogs twitching their paws as if running, their breathing quickening in rhythm to imagined pursuit, while captive otters made soft chuffing sounds as they mimed swimming through dark water. More astonishing still, are the octopuses and cuttlefish filmed by marine biologists in Okinawa and Hawaii, whose skin changes color as they sleep, flashing the same patterns they use when hunting or hiding. In 2019, researchers at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte recorded these color shifts repeating in precise cycles, suggesting that even these invertebrates experience dreamlike statsa, shimmering choreography of memory replayed through pigment and muscle. The implication is profound. Dreaming, or something like it, may stretch across vast evolutionary distances. Mammals, birds, and perhaps even cephalopods seem to share this nightly rehearsal, indicating that the purpose of dreaming might lie in ancient neural architecture rather than modern consciousness. For birds, REM occurs in bursts lasting only seconds. Yet those moments may help them refine the complex songs they learn from their parents. For dolphins and seals, who sleep with only one half of their brain at a time, the dream may be a quieter, one-sided echo, a partial rehearsal that keeps them alert to predators while still allowing restoration. The universality of these patterns hints that the ability to simulate experience in sleep offers an unmistakable advantage, adaptation through imagination, and still. For all its biological grounding, dreaming remains something more than function. In the solitude of sleep, the mind not only replays fear but reorders it, translating chaos into story, terror into symbol, survival into wisdom. What begins as a neural rehearsal becomes a kind of narrative therapy, one that turns raw emotion into meaning. The frightened child who dreams of falling learns to wake and stand again. The hunter who dreams of being pursued sharpens his senses before dawn. Even the modern mind, haunted by stress and noise, uses the same mechanism to sift what it cannot face in daylight. In this sense, dreaming is an inheritance from every creature that ever needed to survive the night, a biological ritual older than language, older than fire. It unites the sleeping cat and the dreaming astronaut, the bird rehearsing its song and the human mind rehearsing its fears. Long before consciousness learned to reason, it learned to imagine. And in that imagination lay the first seed of survival. Dreams are not random flickers of a resting brain, but the continuation of life by other means. The mind's quiet way of keeping watch in the dark. For thousands of years before, laboratories began recording brain waves or mapping the electric storms of sleep. Entire civilizations already treated dreams as bridges between worlds, as threads that bound the visible and the invisible together. And long before the word neuroscience was ever spoken, people believed that the images seen at night were not illusions but messages, not confusion but guidance, across continents and centuries. Dreams were regarded as part of life itself, as real as waking breath. And among the many traditions that shaped this view, none became more enduring than those of the indigenous peoples of North America, Australia, and the Pacific, who saw dreaming not as an escape from the world but as a way of participating more deeply in it. Among the Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region, dreams were not accidents of sleep but woven signs of destiny. And to dream was to listen to the spirits that moved through the forest, the lakes, and the wind. Every child was taught that the night carried voices, that one must respect them and learn to separate the true from the false. For some, dreams came from good spirits who wished to protect, while others came from tricksters who delighted in confusion. To help guard against the latter, elders crafted objects known in their language as a sabacation, meaning spiderweb, which later came to be called dream catchers. The legend tells of a Saibakashi, the spider woman, who took care of the children and people of the land, weaving her web each morning to catch the sun. When the Ojibwe nation spread across great distances, she could no longer reach them all. So mothers and grandmothers began to weave their own webs of willow hoops and sinew, hanging them above the cradles of infants, according to the tradition. Good dreams would pass gently through the hole at the center of the web and drift down the feathers to the sleeper below, while bad dreams would be trapped in the threads and dissolved by the first light of dawn. Early anthropologists, such as Frances Dinsmore in her 1929 recordings of Ojibwe songs and rituals, noted that these objects were not decorations, but instruments of protection, carrying stories of balance and respect between human beings and the spirit world. In modern times, the dreamcatcher has spread far beyond its origin, often reduced to ornament, yet its meaning remains a reminder that for the Ojibwe and many other tribes, dreams were sacred territory, an exchange between the soul and the unseen. Far across the world, on the vast and ancient continent of Australia, the Aboriginal peoples held an even more encompassing vision of dreaming, one that reached beyond the individual sleeper into the foundation of existence itself. In their cosmology, dream time called Jukurpa among the Pichanjatata and Alcharenga. Among the Araranti was not a time in the past, but an eternal present, the realm in which the world was sung into being. According to these traditions, ancestral beings moved through the landscape, shaping rivers, mountains, and stars by their actions, leaving songlines that traced both geography and meaning. To dream in this sense was not to escape from the world, but to enter it more fully. To walk once again in the footsteps of the ancestors who never truly departed. For the Aboriginal peoples, every hill, rock, and waterhole was a record of these original journeys, and dreams were the key to remembering them. Anthropologists such as W.E.H. Stanner, writing in the mid-20th century, described how dreamtime served as a living law, connecting every person to place and lineage through memory and story. When a hunter dreamed of a specific animal, it was interpreted as a call to ceremony or a warning of imbalance. When a child dreamed of a distant place, it was said that their spirit had traveled along a song line, reaffirming their connection to country. These dreams were not analyzed for hidden desires as Freud might have done, but for their harmony or dissonance with the laws of creation. The dream was not private, it was communal, a dialogue between the dreamer, the land, and the ancestors. The reverence for dreams as pathways of knowledge extended far beyond these regions. In Polynesian cultures, for example, dreams were understood as visits from spirits or ancestors, known as mohan in Hawaiian, literally soul sleep. In these dreams, advice, warnings, and messages were believed to arrive through symbols: the ocean rising, a bird calling, a familiar face turned away. Similarly, among the Mbori of New Zealand, the term momo described both dream and vision, blurring the distinction between sleeping and waking revelation. In each of these traditions, dreaming was not a solitary experience, but a shared spiritual practice. Woven into the daily fabric of life, what is striking in the light of modern science is how closely these ancient intuitions align with what neuroscience now reveals about the brain. The idea that dreams serve as communication between different layers of consciousness, between the emotional and rational. The ancient and modern parts of the brain finds unexpected resonance with contemporary research on REM sleep, which shows that during dreaming, the limbic system, associated with memory and emotion, interacts freely with sensory regions, while the prefrontal cortex, the seat of control and criticism, rests. The result is an unfiltered conversation between instinct and imagination. Much like the dialogue indigenous traditions have always described between spirit and self, even the symbolic language of dreams, once considered purely mystical, has its neurological counterpart. Studies from the early 2000s at the University of Montreal demonstrated that the brain processes emotionally charged imagery during REM as though it were lived experience, reinforcing emotional regulation and resilience. In this light, the Ojibwe belief that bad dreams are caught and dissolved while good ones flow through becomes more than metaphor. It reflects a real process by which the brain filters emotional residue, keeping what nourishes and releasing what harms. Likewise, the Aboriginal view that dreaming restores connection to land and memory echoes how REM sleep consolidates spatial memory and personal narrative, linking the individual to their larger environment across all cultures and ages. The dream remains the bridge between two kinds of knowing, the rational and the intuitive, the measurable and the sacred. What the elders saw in the flicker of the night sky, scientists now glimpse through machines glowing in the dark, and though the languages differ, both describe the same wonder, that within the stillness of sleep, the human mind continues to reach outward, to weave, to remember, to protect. Whether hung above a cradle, sung along a red desert track, or studied beneath the pulse of an fMRI, The dream endures as the most ancient of instruments, a net for catching meaning, a map for returning to ourselves. When the world entered the long twilight of the Cold War, scientists and governments began to look not only outward toward space or the atom, but inward, into the fragile mechanisms of the human mind. And it was in this secret frontier that sleep itself became a subject of control, a field where nations competed to bend biology toward power. What had once been the most private act, closing one's eyes and surrendering to rest, became, in the laboratories of intelligence agencies and military hospitals, a potential weapon, something to be measured, interrupted, prolonged, and manipulated for purposes far removed from healing. The wars of the 20th century had already transformed the body into an instrument of endurance. The Cold War would attempt the same with consciousness, turning the quiet realm of sleep into a battlefield where obedience, resistance, and truth were tested in the dark. In the early 1950s, as the United States and the Soviet Union faced each other in suspicion and fear, both nations began large-scale experiments on sleep deprivation and psychological conditioning. In America, one of the most infamous programs later revealed through declassified documents was the CIA's MK-Ultra project, which ran from 1953 until the early 1970s under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, though most of its records were destroyed in 1973. Fragments that survived revealed a network of covert experiments conducted in hospitals, prisons, and military bases, many involving unwitting subjects. Among these were trials that explored how prolonged wakefulness, combined with drugs and sensory manipulation, might alter consciousness and make the human mind more suggestible. Sleep was seen not as a biological need, but as a gate to be held open or closed at will. Its rhythms disrupted until identity itself began to unravel. Reports from those years speak of volunteers, or in some cases, detainees kept awake under constant light for as long as 90 hours, their thoughts splintering into hallucination and confession. In one 1956 study, later referenced by investigative journalist John Marks in his book The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, subjects were deprived of sleep while being interrogated, their resistance measured against cycles of exhaustion. The findings, though rarely published, suggested that after 72 hours without rest, most people entered a state of heightened vulnerability, where dreams began to intrude upon waking life, blurring truth and imagination. The line between reality and suggestion became porous, and that fragility, terrifying, measurable, and repeatable, was precisely what the intelligence services wanted to understand. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet research followed similar paths, but cloaked its ambitions in the language of endurance and patriotism. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, physiologists at the Institute for Experimental Medicine in Leningrad studied how long soldiers could remain awake under stress. Their methods were often brutal. Test subjects were placed under constant light, their eyelids mechanically held open, while voices and static played endlessly from loudspeakers. The Soviet press later celebrated these studies as demonstrations of discipline and willpower, though the notes recovered decades later described hallucinations, paranoia, and the breakdown of mental function. In one report from 1959, an experimenter wrote that prolonged sleeplessness produces a form of living dream, where subjects spoke to figures no one else could see. By the 1960s, military institutions in both East and West had begun exploring the opposite problem. Not the breaking of sleep, but its artificial management. The United States Air Force funded studies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research to examine fatigue, resistance, and REM suppression. The goal was to create soldiers capable of functioning for extended periods without loss of alertness. An idea born from the demands of modern warfare, where pilots and radar operators might be required to stay awake for 48 hours or more. Researchers experimented with stimulant combinations, caffeine, later modafinil, monitoring the brain's electrical activity to determine how much deprivation could be sustained before irreversible impairment set in. What they discovered was paradoxical. Even when the body could be chemically kept awake, the brain continued to demand its nightly descent. slipping into microbursts of REM that lasted seconds but carried the signature of dreaming. The science of suppression became a discipline of diminishing returns. By the late 1960s, studies led by Dr. Alan Rekshafan at the University of Chicago proved that total deprivation, even in animals, was lethal. Rats deprived of sleep eventually developed lesions, failed immune systems, and died after 2 weeks. Sleep, it seemed, was not optional but foundational. Yet the desire to master it persisted. During the Vietnam War, reports circulated that American forces tested sleep deprivation tactics on prisoners of war, while Soviet counterintelligence developed its own protocols for psychological fatigue induction, claiming it could reveal hidden loyalties. Both sides denied these practices, but whispers of their existence lingered in the margins of military archives and memoirs. The ethical questions surrounding these experiments eventually forced them into the open. In the United States, the Senate hearings of 1975, led by Frank Church's committee, exposed the extent of MKUltra and similar programs. Testimonies described patients at psychiatric hospitals in Montreal, treated under the supervision of Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, who were subjected to psychic driving, long sessions of recorded messages played during chemically induced sleep, intended to erase traumatic memories and replace them with new suggestions. Many awoke with amnesia, confusion, or permanent cognitive damage. What had begun as scientific curiosity had turned into a grim rehearsal of control. Yet even as these dark chapters were revealed, the military interest in sleep continued under new names. In the 1980s and 1990s, research shifted toward optimization rather than deprivation, examining how controlled napping or pharmacological modulation could extend operational efficiency without harm. NASA and the U.S. Army funded studies into circadian rhythm alignment, light exposure therapy, and melatonin regulation, showing that strategic rest could enhance decision-making and reduce error. The language of science had softened, but its roots remained in the same uneasy question. How far can we manipulate the boundary between wakefulness and dreaming before something essential is lost? Today, the ethical scars of that era linger like a shadow cast across every sleep laboratory. The modern neuroscientist who measures REM cycles or designs medication for insomnia works with knowledge extracted from decades of questionable research. What the Cold War revealed, perhaps more clearly than any experiment could, is that sleep is not merely a physiological function, but a moral frontier, a line that defines the limits of human authority. To turn rest into weaponry was to trespass upon the very space where individuality renews itself, the last refuge of autonomy. And though the machines have grown quieter and the language more clinical, the legacy of those secret nights endures, a reminder that the wars inside the pillow were never only about control of the body, but about possession of the dream itself. Every night, while the body drifts between stillness and motion, the chemistry of the brain performs a delicate choreography, a slow and complicated dance of molecules that determines whether a person will sleep deeply, dream vividly, or awaken in restless confusion. Yet in the modern world, this ancient balance has become something that can be altered, purchased, or even erased because humans sleep. Once a natural rhythm shaped only by sunlight and exhaustion, has gradually turned into a territory managed by chemistry and commerce. The dream, which was once regarded as a sacred mystery or a window into the soul, is now quietly shaped by what flows through the bloodstream, the alcohol of an evening drink, the nicotine of a midnight cigarette, the antidepressant meant to steady the day, or the pill that promises control over what the night will bring. It has been known since the early 20th century that alcohol, while sedative in its first touch, is one of the great destroyers of dream sleep. When the body metabolizes ethanol, it depresses the central nervous system and interferes with REM cycles, the very stage where dreaming is most vivid. In the 1960s, sleep studies at the University of Chicago found that subjects who consumed several drinks before bed fell asleep faster but spent less time in REM. And when the effect wore off in the latter half of the night, their brains tried to compensate with what researchers called REM rebound, a surge of intense, often disturbing dreams that left them more fatigued in the morning. Nicotine, too, wove its own pattern into this chemistry. Smokers reported more fragmented sleep, waking often through the night, while withdrawal during quitting led to dream storms vivid, sometimes violent imagery that seemed to flood back once the drug's suppression lifted. The brain, deprived of its stimulant, appeared to reclaim its dreaming with a kind of vengeance. By the 1980s and 1990s, as pharmaceutical research expanded and the world's first selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors SRS, such as fluoxetine, better known as Prozac, entered the market, scientists began to notice another transformation in the architecture of dreaming. These drugs, designed to elevate mood by increasing the availability of serotonin, often reduced the duration of REM sleep. For some patients, this meant fewer nightmares. But for others, it meant the slow fading of dreams altogether, a blankness that spread over the night like fog. Neurologists proposed that serotonin, though essential for emotional balance, worked as a kind of brake on REM mechanisms, dampening the brainstem activity that triggers the vivid, hallucinatory state of dreaming. Dopamine, on the other hand, acted as the spark of imagination and drive within that same circuit. And the interplay between the two, serotonin's calm and dopamine's energy, became a chemical duet that shaped not only mood, but the texture of every dream. As neuroscience entered the 21st century, the fascination with altering dreams moved from medicine into the marketplace. Companies began advertising supplements and lucid dream enhancers that promised to give consumers control over their nightly narratives, claiming that certain compounds, galantamine, choline, or vitamin B6, could extend REM phases or heighten awareness within dreams. In 2015, a startup in California released a capsule called One Aranat, named for the ancient Greek word meaning dream traveler, which combined herbal extracts with neurotransmitter precursors. Their marketing spoke the language of adventure and self-mastery, promising that with proper dosage, the sleeper could learn to steer their own mind as though piloting a small ship through the subconscious. While the scientific evidence remained inconclusive, the idea itself was seductive, that the dream, once spontaneous and mysterious, could be programmed like a device. Parallel to these supplements arose a new generation of sleep technologies: headbands, pods, and wearable monitors that tracked not only heart rate and movement, but the transitions between sleep stages. By the late 2010s, companies like Dream in France and Sleep Score Labs in California offered devices that could detect when a person entered REM and gently stimulate the brain with light or sound to encourage lucid dreaming. These products blurred the line between science and ritual, promising not just rest, but an upgraded experience of consciousness. Sleep, once a surrender, had become a field of optimization and the dream, a territory open for purchase. Amid this technological fervor, the humble hormones of the human body continued their nightly dance, as they had for millennia. Melatonin, secreted by the pineal gland, remained the body's signal for darkness, rising after sunset and coaxing the mind toward rest. It did not induce dreams by itself, but set the stage for them, synchronizing the circadian rhythm with the slow alternation of night and day. Serotonin, generated in the Raphe nuclei, maintained emotional equilibrium, modulating both mood and sleep onset, while dopamine, produced deep in the midbrain, spiked during REM, igniting the vivid sensory fireworks that colored the dream. Studies in the early 2000s by the University of Lübeck in Germany showed that small fluctuations in these neurotransmitters could alter not only the length of dreams, but their emotional tone. Too much dopamine led to intense, sometimes euphoric imagery, while low serotonin left dreams tinged with anxiety or melancholy. The modern sleep industry has learned to speak in the language of these molecules. Shelves in pharmacies and online stores overflow with melatonin gummies, magnesium tonics, L-theanine powders, and countless blends, promising to enhance relaxation and dream quality. Sleep pods and capsules, once confined to airports, have appeared in wellness centers, offering carefully tuned sound frequencies and aromatherapy meant to induce guided REM. Meanwhile, tech giants have entered the market, developing AI-assisted platforms that analyze sleep data across millions of users. generating personalized recommendations for when and how to rest. The dream, it seems, has become one more consumer experience to be adjusted, improved, and sold back to its owner. And yet, beneath all the data and chemistry, the human element persists, the same fragile rhythm that has always governed sleep. For all the substances that can shape it or erase it, the dream remains a mystery, rising from a balance no pill or device can fully replicate. Alcohol may drown it, nicotine may fracture it, antidepressants may silence it, and synthetic enhancers may try to harness it. But still, the mind, given darkness and quiet, finds its own way back into the theater of images. Perhaps the growing market for control only proves how little control we truly have, how deeply we long to manage what was once instinctive, how the chemical dream reflects not only our science but our unease. In the end, no matter what the bloodstream carries, the act of dreaming remains the body's own rebellion, a reminder that even in a world of precision and commerce, the night still belongs to the unseen chemistry of the soul. There is a peculiar moment known only to a few sleepers, when the dreamer suddenly realizes they are dreaming, when awareness returns, not with waking, but within the dream itself. And the mind, startled but unbroken, begins to steer its own fiction. This experience, known as lucid dreaming, has been described for centuries by mystics, monks, and poets. Yet it remained only a rumor of consciousness until science learned how to capture it in the laboratory. The phenomenon raises questions that unsettle the boundary between waking and sleeping. If we can be conscious while we dream, if we can choose what happens within those imagined worlds, then where does reality end and imagination begin? The first modern attempt to study this strange state began in the late 1970s, when researchers realized that even though the body is paralyzed during rapid eye movement sleep, the muscles controlling the eyes remain active. This small loophole in the body's nightly paralysis offered a way for 8 dreamers to communicate with the outside world from within their dreams. In 1975, British psychologist Keith Hearn, working at the University of Hull, asked trained lucid dreamers to move their eyes in a specific pattern, left, right, once they realized they were dreaming. On the polygraph recording, he saw the signal appear as clean, deliberate curves amid the chaotic background of REM. It was, in effect, the first message ever sent from a dream. A few years later, an American researcher named Stephen Loberg, then a graduate student at Stanford University, built upon Hearn's work and transformed lucid dreaming from a myth into measurable science. Loberg trained himself to become lucid within his dreams, practicing techniques of awareness such as counting fingers, focusing on objects, or looking for text that changed when reread. During a series of controlled experiments in the early 1980s, he too signaled his lucidity with prearranged eye movements, while electrodes recorded his brain activity. The data showed unmistakably that consciousness could exist inside REM sleep, the same stage once thought to be pure fantasy. His 1985 book, Lucid Dreaming, brought the subject to public attention and inspired a generation of researchers to treat dreaming not as chaos, but as an accessible state of mind. What Loberg and his colleagues found was extraordinary. Within the lucid dream, sensory regions of the brain behave almost exactly as they do when awake. When a dreamer touches an object, the somatosensory cortex responds. When they look around, the visual cortex flares with activity. The difference lies not in perception, but in control. In waking life, perception is bound by external reality. In dreams, the rules can be rewritten at will. A lucid dreamer can decide to fly, to walk through walls, or to call for someone long lost. And the brain, accepting the command as genuine, creates the corresponding experience. Loberg's laboratory subjects reported sensations so real that they had to perform mental checks upon, waking to convince themselves they were back in the physical world through the 1980s and 1990s. Experiments continued to explore how far this internal control could go. At the Max Planck Institute in Germany, Dr. Ursula Voss and her team used EEG and fMRI imaging to compare lucid and non-lucid REM sleep. They found that during lucid dreams, The prefrontal cortex, the very region that usually falls silent during sleep, reactivates, allowing the dreamer to regain self-awareness and critical thought. It was as if consciousness had been switched back on while the body remained in its nightly paralysis. The brain, it seemed, was capable of holding two realities at once: the imagined world of the dream and the reflective knowledge of self. This dual awareness explained why lucid dreamers often describe the experience as both thrilling and precarious. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff. Aware that one thought too heavy might collapse the illusion entirely, the sensations reported by lucid dreamers were both exhilarating and profound. Some described soaring over landscapes bathed in impossible light. Others reported conversations with figures that seemed to possess their own intelligence. In one of Loberge's studies from 1983, participants were asked to perform deep breathing exercises inside the dream and their respiration patterns, measured by sensors in the waking world, changed accordingly. This demonstrated that actions taken inside the dream could influence the sleeping body's physiology, linking the two realms more closely than anyone had imagined. Later experiments showed that heart rate and skin conductance could also respond to dream events, as if the body believed entirely in what the mind was inventing. But lucid dreaming is not only a spectacle of wonder. It is also an exploration of control, and with control comes the question of what to do when faced with chaos. Psychologists studying lucid dreamers have noted that many people use the experience to confront fears, to face nightmares directly and alter them. A child who dreams of falling can learn, through lucidity, to spread their arms and fly. Someone haunted by recurring pursuit can turn and meet the pursuer. The therapeutic potential of this state has drawn increasing attention in recent decades. In 2014, clinical trials in Germany and Canada began using lucid dream training to treat post-traumatic stress and chronic nightmares, teaching patients to rewrite their dream narratives and reclaim agency within them. For some, this practice reduced distress and improved sleep quality. Though the act of mastering fear in the dream spilled into waking confidence, yet the psychology of control within the dream is complex. The lucid state is fragile, and the more a dreamer attempts to dominate it, the faster it can collapse. Many researchers note that sustained lucidity requires balance enough awareness to recognize the dream, but enough surrender to let it flow. Too much reasoning, and the spell breaks. Too little, and the dream swallows the self back into its logic. This tension mirrors life itself. The human desire to direct every outcome meets the reality of forces beyond control. Perhaps this is why lucid dreams often end not in triumph, but in awakening. As if the mind, overwhelmed by its own power, retreats into safety. Still, the allure remains. In the decades since Loberge's pioneering work, lucid dreaming has become both a scientific subject and a cultural fascination. Online communities share methods for inducing it wake back-to-bed schedules, mnemonic affirmations, and even sleep masks that flash subtle lights when REM is detected. The technology may have changed, but the curiosity remains the same, as it was in ancient accounts from Tibet, where monks practiced dream yoga, believing that awareness in sleep could lead to enlightenment. In both the laboratory and the monastery, the purpose is the same: to awaken within the illusion and see what lies beneath it. Lucid dreaming reveals something essential about the human condition, that even in the most uncontrollable state of the mind, there is a yearning to understand, to guide, to create meaning. The dream becomes a mirror, reflecting not just fantasy, but the quiet struggle between freedom and surrender. To know that one is dreaming is to glimpse the machinery of the mind at work, to stand inside its theater and realize that the stage, the actors, and the audience are all the same. And when the dreamer finally wakes, there lingers the faint memory of that paradoxical clarity, the knowledge that even in chaos, consciousness can find a moment of light, a breath of choice. Before the night folds shut again, there was a time, not so long ago, when the night belonged entirely to silence, when darkness itself served as the body's signal to withdraw, to rest, and to dream without interruption. But over the past 3 decades, that silence has been broken by the steady pulse of screens. Alerts, and invisible networks that stretch into every corner of our private lives. The modern world, lit by blue light and driven by constant connection, has created a strange new kind of insomnia, always the sleeplessness of anxiety or disease. But the quieter erosion of rest itself, a condition in which people sleep but never fully surrender, dream but never fully drift away. Sleep, once a sanctuary, has become another frontier of data, marketing, and attention, and the consequences reach deeper than fatigue. The story begins with light, because light is the oldest regulator of time in the human body. For hundreds of thousands of years, the brain's circadian rhythm followed the slow, predictable pattern of the sun's rise and fall. At dusk, the pineal gland secreted melatonin, signaling the body to prepare for rest. And as dawn approached, the hormone ebbed, awakening us again. But when the 20th century introduced the glowing screen, a new kind of light entered the human environment, artificial, cold, and persistent. The short wavelengths of blue light, emitted by smartphones, tablets, and LED lamps, mimic daylight with uncanny precision, and the retina, unable to distinguish technology from sunrise, sends the same alert to the brain: stay awake. In 2014, a study conducted by Harvard Medical School showed that people who read on tablets before bed took significantly longer to fall asleep, produced less melatonin, and felt more sluggish the next morning than those who read printed books. The researchers called it biological jet lag. The body tricked each night into believing it had flown across a time zone. This disruption has had measurable effects far beyond individual sleep schedules. Since the 1990s, global studies have shown a steady decline in REM sleep, the stage when dreams occur and memory is consolidated. Surveys by the National Sleep Foundation in the United States and similar institutions in Japan and Europe reveal that the average adult today sleeps almost an hour less per night than they did 30 years ago. And within that shorter duration, the share of REM has fallen by nearly 20%. The reasons are not mysterious. Longer work hours, 24-hour news cycles, late-night entertainment, and the omnipresence of devices all keep the brain on high alert. Even after the body lies down, the mind remains tethered to its digital leash, awaiting the next vibration or message. Neuroscientists studying IG patterns of modern sleepers have noted that the brain now spends more time hovering in light, semi-wakeful stages, a sign that even in rest, vigilance persists. This condition, being half awake in a world that never sleeps, has reshaped more than physiology. It has changed the economy of human attention. What began as a convenience has become an infrastructure of dependency. And nowhere is this more evident than in the rise of sleep technology itself. The very devices that disturb our nights now promise to restore them. Apps track breathing, heart rate, and motion, calculating sleep scores that claim to quantify rest. Smartwatches record REM cycles and send notifications when the body stirs, turning even dreams into data points. The irony is profound. We wake to study the very sleep we have lost. In 2017, a study by the University of Chicago coined the term orthosomnia to describe anxiety caused by sleep tracking people lying awake, worried that they are not sleeping well enough, according to their devices. The pursuit of perfect rest had become another form of wakefulness. Behind these glowing interfaces lies something more subtle and troubling: the quiet expansion of surveillance capitalism into the most private hours of life. Technology companies now collect millions of nights' worth of biometric data: pulse, temperature, movement, and duration, aggregated across populations and sold to insurers, advertisers, and research firms. The marketing language is one of health and self-improvement. But the business model is extraction, the harvesting of behavior from the one place once considered free from observation. In 2021, analysts estimated the global sleep tech market at nearly $90 billion. It's projected to double by the end of the decade. Every sleepless night becomes a transaction. Every sigh another signal to be analyzed, optimized, and monetized. The bedroom, once the last refuge of privacy, has become another node in the digital economy, where even the rhythm of dreams can be converted into numbers. As this trade in sleep expands, the human relationship to rest has begun to change in ways that are harder to measure but easy to feel. Many people now carry their phones to bed, as if afraid to disconnect, scrolling through endless feeds until exhaustion overtakes them. The light from the screen reflects across their faces like a modern campfire. But instead of stories or song, it offers an infinite stream of noise. Psychologists have begun to warn of the emotional toll of this endless connectivity, the collapse of boundaries between day and night, work and home, public and private. The brain, they note, was not built for constant stimulation. It requires the slow fade of silence to recover. Without it, the nervous system never truly resets. And the dream, that nightly theater where emotion and memory are reconciled, becomes fragmented, shallow, or absent altogether. In some ways, the situation recalls an older caution, voiced long before the invention of the screen. In 1964, Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan warned that every new technology extends the senses while simultaneously numbing them. And in that tension lies both progress and peril. The devices that connect the world have extended consciousness across time zones, but they have also dulled the ability to retreat inward. To never fully switch off is to live in a permanent twilight, where the line between waking and sleeping blurs, and even the dream is forced to compete with the glow of the machine. What the modern age has stolen is not merely hours of rest, but the very condition of solitude that makes dreaming possible. In the quiet of true sleep, the mind wanders without agenda, reorganizing the day's noise into meaning. But when that quiet is replaced by a chorus of notifications and blue light, the mind loses its freedom to drift. The result is a generation of half-dreamers, exhausted yet alert, sleeping with one eye open to the screens that both soothe and enslave. The machines hum through the night, recording pulse and motion, counting breaths. While outside the windows, the cities burn their electric daylight into the stars. The night has become a network, and in its glow, humanity drifts between waking and sleeping, unsure which is which, longing for the silence it once called rest every morning. As sunlight filters through the window and the first sounds of the day return, most people awaken with a faint awareness that something has happened in the night of feeling. A glimpse of movement, a conversation that now dissolves like mist the moment they try to hold it. Within a minute, 9 out of 10 dreams vanish, leaving behind only fragments, a color, a voice, the echo of an emotion. It is a universal forgetting, so common that we rarely question it. Yet the mystery of why dreams slip from memory so quickly has long haunted both scientists and philosophers. The human mind, capable of recalling a face from childhood or a melody after decades, seems powerless to remember. It's what it itself created only moments before. The explanation begins not with psychology, but with biology. In the strange architecture of the sleeping brain. During rapid eye movement sleep, the stage, most associated with vivid dreaming, the hippocampus. The small, seahorse-shaped structure deep within the temporal lobe becomes partially disengaged. It is the hippocampus that normally takes experiences from the short-term store of consciousness and transfers them into long-term memory, weaving the events of a day into a coherent narrative that can be recalled later. But in REM sleep, this process slows almost to silence. Electroencephalographic studies from the 1990s onward, particularly those led by neurobiologist Robert Stickold at Harvard, revealed that while the brain's visual and emotional centers blaze with activity during dreaming, the hippocampus shows a marked drop in signal. As if the gatekeeper of memory has stepped away from its post. The mind continues to build images and stories, but no one is there to record them. When the sleeper wakes, the dream fades not because it never existed, but because it was never properly written into the archive of self. There is also the matter of chemistry. During REM sleep, the neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and serotonin, both crucial for attention and memory consolidation, are almost absent. In their place rises acetylcholine, which promotes vivid internal imagery but does not preserve it. This chemical imbalance creates a paradoxical condition. Dreams are intensely felt, yet biologically unrecorded. The mind experiences them as real, but the moment consciousness returns, The circuitry required to store those experiences comes back online, finding nothing solid to preserve. The dream collapses like a soap bubble in the air. For centuries, people refused to accept this vanishing as inevitable. Long before the language of neurons and neurotransmitters, his dreamers tried to resist the forgetting by transforming memory into ritual. In ancient Mesopotamia, tablets inscribed around 2000 BCE show priests recording dreams on clay each morning, consulting them as messages from the gods. The Egyptians kept similar records in what they called the Chester Beatty Papyrus, listing dream symbols alongside their meanings. To dream of drinking warm beer signified illness. To dream of clear water promised truth. These early archivists treated the dream as a form of communication that demanded translation before it disappeared. In the Greek temples of Asclepius, the sick would sleep and report their visions at dawn to attendants who wrote them down. Believing that each detail carried divine instruction for healing, even Aristotle, who doubted the supernatural, kept his own notes on recurring dreams, wondering why they seemed both trivial and profound. In modern times, the tradition of recording dreams continued, shifting from ritual to introspection. The psychologist Sigmund Freud, in his 1900 work, The Interpretation of Dreams, famously relied on his patients' recollections of their nightly imagery to uncover what he believed were buried desires. He encouraged them to keep dream diaries, writing immediately upon waking to preserve the fragile traces before they faded. His successor, Carl Jung, took this practice further, maintaining meticulous notebooks of his own dreams throughout his life, many later published as the Red Book, a vast illustrated record of visions that shaped his theories of the unconscious. For these thinkers, the dream diary was not only a tool of memory, but a mirror of the self, a way to trace the mind's secret language over time. Outside the clinic, countless others have joined this quiet resistance against forgetting. Artists like Salvador Dali and writers like Franz Kafka and Annie Nin kept bedside journals, believing that dreams, if caught in the first moments of waking, could feed creativity and insight. The surrealists of the early 20th century built their entire movement on the conviction that dreams revealed the raw material of imagination. Yet even they lamented the loss that occurred between sleep and penned the fleeting visions that vanished before they could be named. In 1959, the poet Sylvia Plath wrote in her journal, "I have tried to write them, but they evaporate like morning breath." Modern neuroscience has confirmed what poets always suspected, that dream memory is an unstable phenomenon, dependent on a narrow window of retrieval. Studies show that if a person is awakened during REM sleep, they can recall their dream in vivid detail. But if allowed to sleep only a few minutes longer, that memory weakens dramatically. It is not the depth of the dream, but the timing of waking that determines remembrance. This fragility reveals something profound about human identity itself, that our sense of self, our continuity from day to day, depends on what the brain chooses to keep. The dream exists outside this continuity, a private performance witnessed only once. There is something almost merciful in this forgetting. If every dream were remembered, consciousness might drown in its own reflections. The mind protects its stability by discarding what does not serve waking life, letting only a few fragments slip through, the ones charged with enough emotion to survive. A sudden fall, a lost face, a burst of light, these become the fossils of the night, clues that something vast occurred just beyond recall. Yet for some, this forgetting carries a sadness, a sense that part of life is perpetually erased. The dream diary, in its quiet persistence, becomes an act of defiance against impermanence, a way of saying that what happens in the dark matters, even if the day insists on forgetting. In the end, the forgotten archive of dreams is not lost entirely. It lingers in the unconscious, influencing mood, decision, and creativity in ways we do not see. The painter's inspiration, the sudden intuition, the inexplicable fear or joy, all may be echoes from that unrecorded world. To dream is to live twice, once in waking and once in shadow. And though we remember only one of those lives, both shape who we are. Perhaps forgetting is not a failure, but the price of balance. The mind's way of ensuring that each morning begins clean, The past night folded away like a manuscript left unread, hidden somewhere in the library of the soul, across the surface of the modern world. From the sleepless towers of New York to the endless glow of Tokyo's neon streets, there exists a quiet and spreading crisis, one that no news broadcast or economic chart can fully measure, because it unfolds not in public squares but in bedrooms and behind the closed eyes of billions. It is the crisis of no sleep, the slow erosion of rest in a civilization that has forgotten darkness. What began as triumph, the mastery of night through technology and light, has become an invisible epidemic that now defines the modern condition, a species that works, worries and wanders far into the hours once reserved for dreaming. Unable to find its way back to the rhythm of silence, the 20th century was the century that conquered the night. The invention of the incandescent bulb in the late 1800s, followed by the expansion of electricity grids and 24-hour industries, extended waking life beyond its natural boundaries. By the 1950s, cities like New York proudly advertised themselves as the city that never sleeps, an emblem of modern vitality, while Tokyo's Ginza district, glowing with signs in motion, became the eastern mirror of that same ambition. Yet beneath this celebration of progress was a quiet transformation in human biology. The night no longer commanded retreat. Work continued under fluorescent light, screens multiplied. And by the time the 21st century began, the global average of nightly sleep had fallen to less than 7 hours. The decline was not gradual, it was deliberate, cultural choice dressed as necessity. Insomnia, once a personal affliction, has become a shared condition. The World Health Organization estimates that nearly 40% of adults worldwide experience chronic sleep disruption. It's 1 in 10 meets the clinical definition of insomnia. In the United States, Centers for Disease Control has gone so far as to classify insufficient sleep as a public health epidemic. Similar warnings have been issued in Japan, where the phenomenon has earned its own termini miri, meaning sleeping while present, describing exhausted workers dozing on trains or at their desks. The sleeplessness of these nations is not born of poverty or displacement, but of relentless productivity, a rhythm that erases the boundary between work and rest. The effects of this sleeplessness reach far beyond fatigue. Neuroscientists such as Matthew Walker of the University of California, Berkeley, have shown through decades of research that chronic loss of REM sleep, the phase where dreaming occurs, correlates strongly with anxiety, depression, and what he calls moral fatigue, the slow dulling of empathy and judgment caused by emotional exhaustion. In one of his studies, published in 2007, brain scans of sleep-deprived individuals revealed overactivity in the amygdala, the region associated with fear and aggression, and decreased connectivity with the prefrontal cortex, which governs reason and control. The result is a population more reactive, more irritable, and less capable of compassion. Sleep, it seems, is not merely rest. It is the nightly repair of humanity itself. Dreaming, too, has suffered its own decline. As REM sleep shortens, the dream world that once served as the mind's emotional archive begins to collapse. Without it, the psyche loses its quiet mechanism for processing memory and pain. Psychologists studying patients deprived of REM sleep have observed an eerie numbness. Emotions that should fade linger, and grief, instead of softening with time, remain sharp. In this sense, the epidemic of insomnia is not only physical, but existential. A society that does not dream forgets how to integrate its own experiences, how to translate suffering into meaning. The physical toll is equally severe. Sleep governs nearly every system in the body, from immune function to metabolism, and when the nightly cycle breaks, the consequences accumulate silently. In the 1990s, long-term studies from the University of Chicago demonstrated that people restricted to 4 hours of sleep for several nights showed signs of premature aging, reduced insulin sensitivity, higher blood pressure, and suppressed immune response. By 2010, follow-up research confirmed that chronic sleep deprivation increased the risk of heart disease, obesity, and even certain cancers. The connection between sleeplessness and modern illness is no longer speculation. It is fact, measurable in hospital wards and statistical charts. Yet culturally ignored, the psychological consequences unfold in subtler ways. The constant light of the modern city's street lamps, billboards, LED screens has severed humanity's instinctive dialogue with darkness. For most of human history, night was a time of restoration, a boundary that defined the rhythm of life. Darkness brought stillness, silence, and the surrender of control. To live always in light is to lose the capacity for that surrender. Sociologists studying urban populations have noted that sleeplessness correlates not only with stress but with a loss of introspection. When people are never fully alone in the dark, they are rarely alone with their thoughts. The night, once a teacher of patience and reflection, has been replaced by the ceaseless hum of illumination.
In Tokyo, trains run past midnight and convenience stores glow at every corner.
In New York, Times Square remains bright enough to cast shadows at 3 in the morning. Both cities, symbols of human progress, now measure success in motion rather than rest. Yet behind this brightness lies exhaustion. Suicide rates in Japan, burnout in the United States, the global spread of anxiety and sleeplessness, all trace back, at least in part, to this denial of darkness. To refuse rest is to declare war on one's own biology, and though the body endures for a time, the cost accumulates invisibly until the line between exhaustion and illness blurs. There is a cruel irony in this progress. The same technologies that promise efficiency, phones, computers, artificial light also erode the very condition that makes efficiency possible. The brain that is denied rest becomes less creative, less adaptive, and more prone to error. Pilots, doctors, and drivers who work without sleep experience impairments equivalent to alcohol intoxication. Yet society continues to treat wakefulness as virtue. To stay up late is to be industrious. To rest is to appear idle. But in truth, it is the sleepless mind that falters. The tired civilization that mistakes motion for growth, in the end. The crisis of no sleep is not only a biological epidemic, but a cultural one, a failure to respect the rhythm that once defined human existence. The ancients understood the sanctity of night. They built rituals around the setting sun, trusting that darkness was part of the order of things. Today, we live in an age that has forgotten to dim its lights, to close its eyes, to dream. The cost is measured not merely in lost hours, but in the quiet erosion of empathy, memory, and meaning. Humanity's progress, for all its brilliance, has come at the expense of its most basic harmony, the simple, necessary act of surrendering to the dark and letting the world, for a few precious hours, fade into silence. In the dim corridors of intensive care units, where machines hum steadily and monitors flicker with numbers that decide life or death, there are people who seem suspended between two worlds' bodies, breathing through tubes, eyes closed, unresponsive. Their minds hidden behind a silence so deep that even their families no longer know if they are present. For centuries, such states were interpreted as complete darkness, the soul withdrawn, the brain inert. Yet in recent decades, as neuroscience has grown more sophisticated and imaging technologies have begun to read the faint signatures of consciousness, an unsettling truth has emerged. Even within coma, fragments of dreaming may survive. And the line between sleep, hallucination, and awakening may not be as absolute as once believed. It was in the early 2000s that researchers first began to see what they called covert cognition, patients long presumed unaware. Using functional MRI, scientists noticed patterns of activity that resembled the dreaming brain. Flashes of electrical rhythm in the parietal and occipital lobes, regions that light up during rapid eye movement sleep. In 2006, a team led by Adrian Owen at the University of Cambridge asked a comatose woman to imagine playing tennis. To their astonishment, her motor cortex responded in the same way it would have in a conscious, healthy person performing the task. When asked to imagine walking through the rooms of her home, her parahippocampal gyrus and posterior parietal cortex, the regions linked to spatial memory lit up distinctly. Though her body remained still, her brain was alive, navigating invisible spaces like a dreamer moving through the Architecture of memory. What these findings suggested was that some patients, in a vegetative state, might experience an interior world not unlike dreaming, a continuous sequence of thought and imagery locked behind an unresponsive shell. The phenomenon raised profound ethical and philosophical questions. If a person can think, feel, or even dream while unable to move or speak, what does it mean to say they are unconscious? The boundaries between life and absence, between the mind's silence and its hidden activity, began to blur. For families and physicians, this ambiguity brought both hope and agony. Hope that awareness persisted. Agony that such awareness might come without agency. A mind trapped within its own body. Neurologists, studying these cases, often compare them to the state known as locked-in syndrome, in which patients are fully conscious but almost entirely paralyzed, capable of moving only their eyes. One of the most haunting accounts came from Jean-Dominique Bauby, the French journalist who in 1995 suffered a massive brainstem stroke. Completely immobile, except for his left eyelid, he dictated his memoir, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, by blinking one letter at a time. In that book, Bauby described a rich internal world where dreams, memories, and hallucinations mingled. My diving bell becomes less oppressive, and my mind takes flight like a butterfly. His descriptions mirrored what neuroscientists would later find in comatose brains: the persistence of imagery, narrative, and emotional resonance, all untethered from physical motion. Sleep researchers such as Giulio Tonone and Marcello Massimini have explored how these liminal states mirror certain aspects of dreaming, noting that the brain, deprived of sensory input, begins to generate its own stimuli. In deep coma or anesthesia, bursts of slow delta waves dominate. But as patients approach partial recovery, faster rhythms resembling REM sleep appear, suggesting that the mind, even when severely impaired, attempts to construct a kind of internal continuity. Some EEG recordings from minimally conscious patients show irregular surges of theta activity, the same pattern seen in transitions between sleep and wakefulness. These flickers may represent moments of dreaming or awareness, though whether the patient experiences them as story, image, or mere sensation remains impossible to know. The ethical implications of this science are immense. Hospitals must now confront the possibility that patients once dismissed as vegetative may retain some capacity to perceive their surroundings, to hear the voices of loved ones, or to dream in isolation. For neurologists and ethicists, this raises questions about consent, treatment, and the moral responsibility of care. Should doctors speak to patients who might hear but cannot respond? Should machines sustain a body whose consciousness flickers like a weak signal? The philosopher Thomas Metzinger once described these conditions as islands of consciousness, isolated patches of awareness floating in the vast sea of the brain's inactivity. To encounter such islands is to realize how narrow the distance truly is between dreaming and dying. Perhaps the most mysterious link between these liminal states and ordinary dreaming lies in reports from survivors of cardiac arrest and near-death experiences. Many describe visions that resemble dreams in structure, but differ in intensity. Bright light, voices, the sensation of floating above one's body. In 2013, a team led by Guillermo Borgigan at the University of Michigan recorded the electrical activity of rats in the 30 seconds following cardiac arrest and discovered a surge of high-frequency gamma waves, the same waves associated with consciousness and vivid dreaming. If similar events occur in humans, it might explain why those revived from clinical death often report what feels like an entire journey, compressed into seconds, a dream that stands on the threshold of eternity. The question of whether comatose or dying brains actually dream remains open. Yet the evidence suggests that consciousness, once ignited, resists extinction. Even when neurons slow and communication falters, mind may continue to weave fragments of memory and imagination into private tapestries. Families who speak softly to loved ones in coma telling stories, playing music, recalling shared moments, may be reaching into that space more effectively than science can measure. A 2014 study from Western University in Canada showed that familiar voices produced measurable responses in the auditory cortex of unresponsive patients, hinting that emotion might still reach them, even if no outward sign returns. There is a poetic symmetry in this discovery, for it means that the dream may be the final companion of life, the last landscape the mind inhabits before it fades. Between waking and oblivion lies a narrow bridge of imagery, memory, and meaning, fragile yet persistent. Whether we call it dream, hallucination, or the flicker of soul, represents the brain's refusal to let go of story, to cease imagining itself into existence. In that sense, the comatose dreamer and the sleeper at home are not so different. Both journey through darkness, guided only by the faint light of awareness. The machines that watch and record can measure waves and patterns, but they cannot tell us what it feels like to drift in that silent ocean, half aware, half gone, waiting for morning or for nothing at all. In the laboratories of modern neuroscience, where the soft hum of computers merges with the quiet rhythm of sleeping subjects, a new frontier is taking shape, one that seeks not only to study dreams but to capture them, to translate the secret language of the sleeping brain into images that can be seen, stored, and perhaps one day replayed. For as long as people have dreamed, they have wondered whether the visions that pass behind closed eyes could ever be preserved. But until recently, this seemed as impossible as bottling smoke. Now, with the rise of artificial intelligence and that impossibility is beginning to dissolve. And the dream itself, once the most private of experiences, ends on the verge of becoming observable, analyzable, and, to some, dangerously public. The earliest experiments that hinted at dream decoding began in Japan in the early 2010s, at the Advanced Telecommunications Research Institute in Kyoto, where neuroscientist Yukiyasu Kamitani and his team conducted a series of studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging to map the activity of the visual cortex during sleep. Volunteers were fitted with sensors and scanned as they drifted through the early stages of dreaming. When awakened at intervals, they were asked to describe what they had just seen: faces, animals, vehicles, or places in. These verbal reports were compared against patterns of brain activity. Over time, machine learning algorithms trained on the data began to recognize correlations, predicting, with surprising accuracy, what kind of imagery the sleeper had experienced. In 2013, Kamitani's team announced that they could identify broad categories of dream content, essentially reading the outline of a dream from the brain itself. It was not cinema, not yet even a photograph, but it was the first step toward seeing the unseen. Since then, the technology has advanced with unsettling speed. By the 2020s, research at institutions like UC Berkeley and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology had begun to use deep learning models, capable of reconstructing more detailed imagery. These systems, trained on massive datasets of visual information, compared the electrical activity of the brain's visual regions with the images people viewed while awake, then applied those same mappings to activity recorded during REM sleep. The results were rough, abstract, often blurred like watercolor paintings but recognizable. A red car, a sleeping dog, a corridor lined with doors. What was once a metaphor, to watch one's own dreams, had begun to take literal form. The implications of such work reach far beyond science. Philosophers and ethicists immediately raise the question: if we can watch our dreams, do they cease to be dreams? The essence of dreaming lies in its secrecy, its untranslatable intimacy, and the fragile wall that separates it from waking life. To observe a dream is to alter it, to make the unconscious conscious, and in doing so, something essential may be lost. Freud himself warned in 1915 that the dream's power comes from disguise, from its resistance to direct interpretation, and that to drag it fully into light is to destroy the very mechanism that gives it meaning. Yet in the modern laboratory, the act of observation is no longer symbolic but technical, and with every advancement in decoding algorithms, the distance between self and surveillance narrows. The commercial world, always quick to follow scientific discovery, has already begun to imagine how such technology might be used. In 2022, a startup in California called Neurosight unveiled a prototype night interface designed to track and visualize dream content in real time using IG and AI. Reconstruction, promising applications in therapy, creativity, and entertainment. Investors hailed it as the future of self-understanding, while critics saw in it the final erosion of privacy, a window not into the world, but into the mind itself. If a person's dreams can be decoded, could they also be monitored, stored, even sold? What happens when the last refuge of autonomy, the landscape of sleep, becomes one more source of data? At the same time, the scientific promise is undeniable. For patients suffering from nightmares, trauma, or locked-in conditions, dream decoding could offer communication where language cannot. Imagine a person in a coma whose neural activity could be translated into visual form, revealing whether they are conscious, whether they dream, whether they wish to awaken or rest. For artists and writers, suggests a new collaboration between mind and machine, the possibility of recording inspiration in its rawest form, filtered by the distortions of memory. Neuroscientists like Kamitani and Jack Gallant at Berkeley have spoken cautiously about this potential, emphasizing that true dream reconstruction remains far away and that the results so far are only approximations, reflections in rippled water. But the direction is clear, and each year the images grow sharper. Still, even among researchers, there is unease. To extract dreams is to cross a boundary older than civilization, one that separates experience from observation. In ancient cultures, dreams belonged to the gods or to the spirit world, and their meaning was approached through ritual, not measurement. Now, with sensors and algorithms, humanity is performing its own secular divination. Reading the electric whispers of neurons as if decoding prophecy. The ethical challenge is not only whether the technology should exist, but how it will alter our understanding of self. A dream replayed on a screen becomes an object, detached from the intimacy that gave it power. It can be paused, analyzed, and judged. A nightmare that once vanished with dawn may now live on in permanent archive. This tension between exploration and intrusion defines the age of the dream recorders. It reflects the broader dilemma of a world that measures everything, that believes what can be captured is what can be known. But dreaming resists full capture because it is both memory and invention, both chaos and order. Even if machines one day decode every flicker of REM, they may never grasp why a dream matters, why one image haunts and another fades. The machine can replay the scene, but it cannot feel the fear, the wonder, the loss. That remains the province of the dreamer alone. And yet the pursuit continues as relentless as curiosity itself. In laboratories across the world, volunteers lie in darkness, their heads surrounded by sensors, their minds traversing landscapes no one else can see, while computers hum softly. Beside them, translating thought into pattern, pattern into image. Somewhere on a monitor, a shape begins to form a doorway, perhaps, or a cloud ant. A scientist leans forward, watching the first rough outlines of a dream drawn by artificial light. It is a moment both miraculous and unsettling, a glimpse into the final private space of humanity. For in the end, what the dream recorders are chasing is not merely data or discovery, but the oldest desire of all, to witness the unseen. To catch the flicker of the soul before it slips once more into darkness. Across all the centuries that have passed since human beings first looked into the dark and wondered what moved behind their eyelids at night, there has always been a quiet conviction that the dream was more than illusion. It was a kind of passage, something that connected the waking world to a deeper, more elusive plane of being. In the temples of ancient Egypt, the priests of Serapis and Imhotep lay on stone beds waiting for divine visions, believing that the gods spoke through the language of dream. The Greeks built sanctuaries for the same purpose, calling the practice incubatio, a holy sleep in which healing and prophecy could take place. In India, the Upanishads describe dreaming as one of the four states of the soul, a realm where the self, untethered from the body, glimpsed the truth of its origins. And in the high monasteries of Tibet, monks practiced dream yoga, seeking to carry awareness across the fragile threshold between waking and rest. believing that mastery of the dream could prepare the spirit for the moment of death. To those civilizations, sleep was not an ending but a door, and dreams were the light that shone through its keyhole. Centuries later, science would claim that same door and rename its mysteries in the language of neurons, hormones, and brain waves. Yet even now, when machines can map the firing of each synapse, the experience itself remains beyond translation. The modern neuroscientist, standing where the ancient priest once stood, still confronts the same question. What is this place we go to when consciousness dissolves, and why does it return us changed? The brain, as we now understand it, follows a rhythm of rising and falling activation through the night. As it drifts from deep sleep toward the surface of waking, it passes through a narrow band of transition known as the hypnopompic state, a brief interval where the dream and the world overlap. Electroencephalographic studies have shown that in those few seconds, the frontal lobes reawaken first, restoring logic and attention, while the visual and emotional regions, especially the amygdala and the limbic system, still pulse with the residue of REM. The mind, half rational and half imagining, begins to piece together the fragments of its internal theater, with the first stimuli of the room, the glint of light through the curtain, the hum of traffic, the warmth of the pillow, and from this blending of memory and perception arises the first sensation of morning. At that instant, something extraordinary occurs. The chemical balance of the brain shifts abruptly. Acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter that fuels the vivid sensory hallucinations of REM, cedes, while norepinephrine and serotonin surge back into activity, stabilizing thought and restoring linear time. The dream's colors fade, its logic collapses, and the narrative dissolves into fragments that make sense only as emotion. We awaken with the residue of awe, fear, or longing, but without the story that produced it. This neurological flicker, turning of one consciousness into another, may be the truest metaphor for human existence itself. A continual crossing between what can be measured and what can only be felt. Throughout history, that brief silence after the dream fades has carried immense significance. For mystics, it was the moment of revelation, the space where messages might be understood before memory dissolved. For poets and philosophers, it became the symbol of impermanence, the reminder that everything experienced, no matter how vivid, must eventually vanish. Even in modern psychology, the same silence is treated as meaningful. Freud saw it as resistance, the mind's self-defense against unbearable knowledge, while Jung considered it sacred, the gap through which archetypal truths might slip into consciousness. In this way, the act of waking becomes not an escape from illusion but a confrontation with it, a realization that the dream was no more strange than the life we return to. Perhaps that is why people continue to chase the dream long after they have awakened. The dream is unfinished thought, a reflection of desire and fear, unbound by logic, and though we call it fiction, it shapes the stories we tell in daylight. Artists, inventors, and scientists have all drawn upon its remnants, Elias Howe claiming that the idea for the sewing machine's needle came from a dream of spears. August Kekule envisioning the benzene ring as a snake biting its tail. Paul McCartney hearing the melody of Yesterday before he could write a single note. What they glimpsed was not the supernatural, but the mind in its most liberated state, freed from the restraints of order, allowed to imagine without consequence. And yet, even for them, the dream's power existed only in memory, a spark carried across the threshold before the door closed again. Modern neuroscience now frames this transition in material terms. At the edge of waking, the thalamus begins to synchronize sensory input, while the prefrontal cortex resumes its command of awareness. The brain reassembles its map of the body, anchoring the drifting self back into form. Yet despite the precision of such explanations, the experience itself resists simplification. To awaken is to feel time restart, to sense gravity reclaim the floating mind, to remember the name of the world, but also to mourn the loss of whatever realm has just receded. In those seconds, before full alertness returns, a person may glimpse what some describe as the place beyond sleep, a zone neither physical nor metaphysical. but somewhere in between, where thought still moves without direction and the boundaries of self are fluid. Some neuroscientists call it the transitional limen, while poets have simply called it dawn. The more humanity learns about the mechanics of sleep, the more that threshold seems to expand rather than contract. Machines can record the rhythm of our hearts and the flicker of our neurons, but they cannot tell us why we dream of what we dream, or why those private worlds feel as real as life itself. Whether the dream arises from divine message or chemical pattern, from memory or from mystery. Its power lies in its ability to remind us that consciousness is not fixed, it moves, shifts, and returns like the tide. Each awakening is a rebirth, each night a rehearsal for disappearance. And so we continue to drift between the two worlds, guided by a rhythm older than reason. The ancients saw the dream as a doorway to the divine. Modern science calls it the theater of the mind. Perhaps both are right. Perhaps the dream is neither sacred nor mechanical, but something in between, a mirror the soul holds up to itself before the morning takes it away. When we wake, we carry only the reflection, never the face. Yet that reflection is enough to keep us searching, night after night. For the place beyond sleep, the borderland where silence turns to light and the mind, for a fleeting moment, remembers what it was before it began to wake.